On this episode of the Investment Opportunity Podcast, we're joined by guest David Eppers, CFO of Carespring Healthcare Management, to discuss operating through COVID.
Welcome to the Investment Opportunity Podcast. We'll educate you on the latest investment trends happening in one of the hottest real estate classes, skilled nursing and seniors housing. We'll point out the risks so you can reap the rewards of investing in this growing and complex industry. And now your hosts, Ben Bohland and Brandon Bohland.
Welcome, everyone, to the Investment Opportunity Podcast. I am Ben Bohland, joined by my brother, Brandon Bohland. We are presented by Senwell Senior Investment Advisors, a senior care and seniors housing investment, mergers and acquisitions investment advisory firm. With us on the show today is David Eppers. David is the Chief Financial Officer for Carespring Healthcare Management, and its family of facilities provide skilled nursing, assisted living, and independent living services to seniors in the Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky communities. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing, guys?
Doing great. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
So, David, you and I had a conversation last week, and you brought a few interesting perspectives to what Carespring is actually doing through this new era. Can you share with our listeners in terms of how you've set up your facilities to adjust to the current environment?
Regarding COVID-19?
Yeah.
Nursing homes, skilled nursing in particular, is in a different fight than most other acute care, for example. We have to make sure that we protect our seniors. So when I think it was about mid-March, when this thing became real for many of us, what we needed to do was make sure our residents in their homes, which is our facilities, and our staff were protected. So the starting point was to make sure we didn't have visitors coming in who could possibly contaminate them with the virus, but also looking for PPE. We needed to have our staff, which we did, have our staff in masks and gowns and so forth, so that they're protected, so that they in turn could keep our seniors protected. And then, to the extent that anybody caught the virus, we didn't have a situation where we had to send multiples of people home, for example. So that's what our operating team did, and I give them credit for doing it early, even though the supplies weren't necessarily there.
So could you talk a little bit about maybe how that strategy might differ from other operating companies? So, for example, like if we look at a state like Kentucky, I think that they're giving a fairly good amount of reimbursement per day if you have COVID in the building, from my understanding. And I guess if you could confirm that, and then what does your strategy look like compared to what you're seeing out there in the market and what other operators are doing today?
Sure. First of all, having the initial thrust was to not have COVID in the building. We ended up, like I said, having PPE and other protocols to keep people separated. And to the extent that somebody actually caught the virus, we had one facility in particular where a staff member had the virus. They were sent home just on suspicion because we were testing everybody. And then a week later, we got the diagnosis, and of course, they stayed home and recovered. At the same time, we had residents who we suspected of having the virus, and they went out to the hospital. There they got tested, and some of them had the virus and others didn't. And of course, they stayed in the hospital until they were ready to return. So as we stand now, we have staff members and residents who had the virus and are recovered that are back in the facility.
Okay. As opposed to if they were in the facility while they were COVID positive.
Right.
To Brandon's point, for example.
Yeah. So if, for example, if somebody's COVID positive and they're in the facility, that's a separate, another issue. We can, and we have with the flu and so forth, where we isolate and quarantine. And we've done those things within our facilities. For example, hospitals weren't testing. So we would get an admission from a hospital, and they weren't tested to make sure that they didn't have the virus. Of course, they were not symptomatic. But what we did at the onset was those people coming into our facilities were in a separate quarantine section for 14 days before they moved into into maybe a general population hallway. Now, that was our approach. I know that there are some other operators who didn't have their staff members in PPE and protective equipment, well into April.
Wow.
and they of course run a different risk. If they have an employee that gets the virus, then you look at who were in contact with, and that person or that group of people would potentially have to go home.
Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned a lot testing. So how has that evolved since the beginning of this virus started to where you stand today with testing? Is that more favorable today than it was, 2 months ago, or are you still in the same spot?
Testing is actually, it's different by state. We operate in 2 states, Kentucky and Ohio. And in Kentucky, they've actually mandated testing for staff and employees,
okay,
or staff and our residents. In our facilities. And that was being implemented just last week. And so they're going through a mandatory testing phase. So from a testing standpoint, it's by state, I'm sure, what people are doing, and it's based on availability and the desire to test. So Ohio is also going to be testing. You mentioned earlier, you asked the question too about reimbursement. Mm-hmm. There really isn't reimbursement per se for our issues. First of all, our issue is protection more so than caring for. Now we've opened some COVID units that I can talk about in a minute, but and that's just recent. But for the most part, our costs have been incurred in additional salaries. We gave people hourly employees a raise as soon as this happened, as soon as this became real. And we needed to retain staff was the key thing. We also had to buy additional PPE, which initially you couldn't find, and then if you could find it, it cost more. So we ended up having to pay the additional for that equipment if we could find it, and which we did. I mean, we do have a good supply. And then there's additional costs in terms of we have people isolated, so they're not going to the dining rooms for their meals. They're going into their rooms. So we're using paper products and so forth, and that's an additional cost. And then just with the protocols, everything is more time intensive. So there's additional challenges in that in terms of staffing and making sure we keep up with all of the residents' needs. And then you have the social aspects. The first thing we did when we found out that we weren't going to have loved ones come into the facilities, which is really an important part of their experience, is having family and friends come in. We bought iPads and actually ended up FaceTiming and doing different things so that they would have some kind of a contact.
How are they adjusting? Are you just out of curiosity, are you using your staff to train them on how to use that and get that up to date on how to do a FaceTime call and things like that?
That's a good question. Frankly, I don't know. I mean, I'm the CFO.
I just know.
I just watched the thing.
Yeah.
Everybody knew how to do it. There's enough tech savvy, and actually we have a good IT department that set them up.
Yeah, that's great.
But in terms of training, I don't think it took much for training.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's many facets to this. As far as reimbursement, it's interesting, kind of being cutting edge and getting the iPads out there, for example. Grant money was available from a federal standpoint like a month later. So the only issue is if you bought it already, you can't use the grant money. So we were ahead of the curve on that. We could step up what we're doing with iPads, for example, communication with grant money, but there wasn't a chance to recover what we've already spent. States are really paying for this additional cost. That's one of the issues. Okay. We did get federal grant money through the CARES Act. Initially, that came based on our Medicare census and our Medicare experience over the past couple of years. They determined an amount that would come to us, and that appeared in our bank accounts. So that's been, definitely a good federal support for us.
Was that a one-time support?
Yeah, it actually came in 2 payments.
Okay.
But it's expected to be one time. I don't know if there's additional funding coming our way from the CARES Act for that component. Okay. But there are other components that are yet to be paid. We did receive another piece of funding in terms of a grant that came just a couple weeks ago that was nursing home specific. So where the first batch was based on Medicare census, so the people who don't have Medicare in their facilities didn't get anything. The second tranche came based on just a census population.
Okay. So was that $4.9 billion relief fund?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So from if I understand that correct, I think that was that $50,000 per facility and $2,500 a bed in addition to that?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So you have two sides of the coin here. You have really no help from the states on the revenue side, just a couple grants that offset these increased expenses you have the PPE, at least when it comes
the grants were fed. Correct.
Yeah, at least when it comes to the states that you operate in, right? Ohio and Kentucky.
Yes.
Okay, so you have the PPE, that obviously all those additional costs. You have the labor, and with the labor, you're giving them raises. Was there much overtime or agency associated with that increased cost as well?
Actually, there was. In some cases people, came into work, of course. But in other cases, they were scared. Right. As a whole, our heroes are really our staff members. They stepped up in a major way. That being said, some of them were afraid. Some of them, had family members that I'm sure told them they shouldn't go in and so forth. And at a certain level, we had some staff that decided not to continue to work. But for the most part, our staff did. Now, that caused some shortages, so we had people work overtime. Because we have very much a special group of staff that care for our seniors in our skilled nursing facilities. It's amazing. They're very mission driven, and they're going to see that the needs are met for our residents. So whatever it took, some incredible people, worked extra hours and did what they needed to do to make sure everybody was cared for and their needs were met.
Yeah, and I think when this is
there's some additional costs. Some of those are hourly, some of them are salary. But from a staffing standpoint, we also are dealing with a census drop. So then we get to the point where you can't retain all the staff. So that's part of the challenge too. When census decreases, which is mainly an issue with just stopping elective procedures in hospitals and just the general fear that would possibly stop somebody from going into a nursing home.
Yeah, and you turn on the news and nursing homes aren't necessarily getting the best coverage right now, and you said it well, that there is a lot of fear, and your mom falls, breaks her hip, goes to have surgery. The kids might not want her in a nursing home right now. So How do you, as an operator, how do you get rid of that stigma that's going? How do we get past this? Well, not only does that pertain to the actual resident and the families, but the employees, as you mentioned, David, as well. I think it's a challenge to bring staffing in, and you had mentioned that you're already losing staff because of this.
Yeah, like I say, it's as a majority, our staff are incredible. We've got, nurses, nurse aides, therapists, dietary staff, and then all of the other functions that are direct care providers, as well as our administrative functions in the facilities that all keep it going. As a whole, I've been in this industry for 30 plus years. It's amazing to see the people who choose to work to care for our seniors, how driven they are to provide that care. So they've stepped up as a whole. That's probably the bigger story. There are some people, like I say, they chose not to come in. But from a majority standpoint, they were going to do what needed to be done, and they still are. Frankly, this is not subsided by any means. And the additional thing is, we have residents that are in their individual rooms, so they need people to come in and care for them. So where they're lacking in socialization, they're not going to the dining room 3 times a day or to other activities and so forth. That's a crucial part of their daily experience that they're missing out on. So we make sure that people come to them. And one of the other areas of support for us was that we are able to skill some of the residents in their room. And by that I mean, we look for some needs for therapy and other things, and make those assessments. And we could qualify them for Medicare, for example, Medicare Part A, which typically, to qualify for a new service to meet the skilling criteria, one of the things is you have to be in a hospital for 3 days. Well, that was waived as part of the response to COVID. That allowed us to then provide that additional care within their rooms, which I think it was a major benefit.
And I think
to the resident.
Absolutely. And I think one additional selling feature, at least for your company, is that you aren't allowing COVID patients in your facilities, or essentially employees. You're saying that they need to be quarantined. That hasn't necessarily been the story that we've heard in other states throughout this entire process. So I think that story is a good one and a positive one, that you're treating it serious, and you're looking at the data that's coming out and treating it as if it is real data and these are real people and it is serious.
Well, yeah, and it's also timing.
That's
so
right.
When we looked at how this was, how we were confronted with COVID-19 initially, and our executive staff is second to none. From Chris Trumbull, our CEO, John Mueller, our COO, and Kim Majik, our one of our officers, our executive team, really analyzed, among others, every bit of information that was coming out in CDC guidelines, and constantly changing. Like, we had to change how you use PPE so that we could extend the life of the PPE, so we had sufficient quantities. So since this evolved, the initial thrust was, yes, we want to keep them out of our facility, keep COVID positive out of our facility to the extent that we knew that they were positive. Now that's changed. We're looking at, we have a couple facilities, because of the physical plant and the decreased in census, we have wings that we could use that have separate entrances where we can treat COVID and take COVID positive residents in those facilities. So we've done that. So we have a couple facilities where the residents are not, they don't need to be hospitalized. They don't, their symptoms are such that, we can care for them and we can care for them very well. And, with our protocol and the physical plants, we can make sure that they are very much safe and the rest of our residents are safe from, getting a COVID infection from the individuals that come in, because we have these separate wings that we could use.
Do you think, you mentioned the physical plant, do you think that we're to the point where we start to look at the existing physical plants going forward, and whether that be through renovation or, as we start to develop new senior housing projects and skilled nursing facilities throughout the country, do you think that's something that people need to start taking a look at a little bit more seriously and kind of reassigning their CapEx to accommodate that?
Our industry is constantly changing. Yeah. In terms of what our demands are from a physical plant, people want more private rooms. People want more amenities. What we do at Carespring is we've always tried to meet those needs. Our founder, Barry Bortz, who passed away in 2016, he had a mission to make sure that our staff's or our residents' needs were met, but also that they really had a nice environment. I always like to hear many times that people who move into our facilities say this is the nicest place I've ever lived in. So to do that, we've had to make changes and accommodate, changing needs. I think that will continue. In terms of from a financial standpoint, what we need in this industry is to have more capabilities to pay for and fund replacement facilities.
Yes.
We're in this challenging phase in our industry where we want to do more, and there's more demands on us for quality and measured quality from the state's perspective, and more documentation. All these things take time and resources. Yet we're asked to do more, but then there's more demands on us, from a physical plant in terms of what people want for amenities and private rooms and things like that. So to meet all of those things, with some buildings that frankly, industry-wide are getting old,
yes.
That creates a huge challenge. So somewhere to meet the needs going forward, we're going to need some additional funding and investment in our industry.
Right. Yeah. That's what it sounds like. You mentioned that the industry's changing. This is an extreme situation where it's just such a fluid environment, and it sounds like you all have done a great job with getting through the chaos, and now we're at a point where you can come up and breathe. But I don't think that you're unlike any other operator in that you're studying the environment and trying to figure out how to best care for the patients, and that's ultimately the most important responsibility. And it sounds like you guys are doing a great job with that, with you and your staff. So David,
thank you.
And one thing I just wanted to ask, kind of before we let you go, is there anything you mentioned a lot of the issues going on with staffing, reimbursement. I guess at the end of the day, what's keeping you up at night today?
I would think the main thing I think about is what's right for our residents. This is their home, so we need to care for them. And then how do we support our staff in this process? And as a whole, I'm not staying up at night, and that's because the leadership that we have at Carespring, and I'm talking down through our facilities and our staff as a whole, they're focused. They're focused on what's going on. The challenge we face is how are we going to roll out of this? Give you an example. We're a very tight margin facility, or industry as a whole, and our facilities are it's a challenge to keep operating. And at 90% occupancy, we do fairly well. Interesting enough, at about 88% occupancy, we struggle.
Doesn't take much, right?
No, it really doesn't. And we are currently at 79% on an average. How do we move forward through the next several months, and who knows how long this is going to last? How do we move forward to get where we need to be on a firm footing financially, so that we can sustain ourselves without grants or additional funding. So that's probably as a CFO, that's my biggest concern is dealing with the unknown.
Yeah.
So and so far, the federal government has stepped up, and the states and state associations are doing I think a good job in analyzing what we need to do going forward. But we're not done yet.
Well, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, are they? I mean, at 79, 80% occupancy, obviously that can't keep up for too long. Are the propcos that you're working with, are they giving you any grace during this time?
That's a good question. So we operate with a REIT and private equity companies, which functionally own our facilities, and we rent them from them in long-term leases. So they have given us moral support, but I don't expect that they're willing to not have a rent payment come in. So from that standpoint, one I talked to, the REIT said they would look at it on a case-by-case basis, but would not, I don't know what they would end up doing if we were not to pay the rent. That's a different relationship. As far as covenant violations, we have certain financial covenants that we need to meet. I did get assurance that they're not going to hold us, accountable for maintaining certain covenants during the COVID-19 epidemic.
Yeah, we're seeing that with other propcos as well.
Yeah.
Well, David, we certainly have appreciated your time and your input here. I think that we've definitely gained some value from this conversation. I certainly appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. Appreciate it.
David Eppers is the Chief Financial Officer at Carespring Healthcare Management, and thank you for joining us on the show today. Thanks, David.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
You too. Hey, welcome to the What You Got segment of the show. This week, I would like to discuss the opportunity to acquire 2 skilled nursing facilities in Western Michigan. Both of these facilities include about 90 beds or so 180 beds total. The owner would like to sell this in one transaction. So total EBITDA is about break even. However, the owner just received their updated Medicaid rate letter, and that should increase the EBITDA by about $300,000. There is additional potential upside, but again, these are turnaround assets in Western Michigan, about 180 beds, and there is some upside here. So if you would like to discuss this opportunity further, please contact me at ben@senwelladvisors.com. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Investment Opportunity Podcast. If you want to hear more about investing in the skilled nursing and seniors housing industry, head to our website at www.senwelladvisors.com/podcast.